All right, hello everyone again. Welcome back to another session on phoneGap. So we're up to week 2 now, and we're really going to start getting into it a bit now. So by the looks of things, from following along the forums, you've all had a fairly interesting week. So definitely something interesting. So there's a lot of work in getting that installation done. So hopefully you've been able to follow through with those videos. I've been following along the forums quite a lot and seeing what's been going on then. So I just wanted to say thanks very much to everybody who's really helped each other out there, because we do have a lot of people in the course, and it's great when one person can get it working and they can help somebody else out along the way. So it is quite a complex undertaking to get it installed, particularly if you're trying to do it across multiple operating systems. So I know we've worked with Android on the PC, and we've done the same on the Mac, and we've also done iOS as well on the Mac. So quite a lot of work there. So I just wanted to say thanks to everybody for that. Thanks also to James for really being involved there with everything he's been doing, answering all the questions. And I can see some people have done really well and had no problem with it, and then others it's been a bit more difficult. And I saw one person even had to reinstall Windows, which was slightly concerning. So hopefully that's not the case for everybody. But I'm assuming now at this point that everybody has a local installation working for them. So we really have to make that assumption at this point, because we're moving along and we need to start doing builds and actually getting into seeing what phoneGap is capable of. So tonight there is going to be a fair bit more configuration, but it's not really in terms of installation. It's more related, I guess, to phoneGap itself. But we'll just have a quick recap so that we're all caught up to where we were last week. So what we talked about last week was a bit of the history and the background of what phoneGap actually is, where it came from, what its purpose is, what it's been designed for, the things that it is for and what it's not for. So we talked about how it's not a complete development environment, it's not a UI, anything like that. But what it does do is it's a set of APIs that lets us talk to the hardware and build HTML into an actual app that can be delivered via the App Store and runs on a phone, so that the phone thinks that it's actually a native application, even though it's using HTML underneath it. And so we talked about how this is a great thing to do, because it means that we can get a lot of the benefits of a native application without having to write languages like Objective-C and other things like that, which can be quite difficult. Now, we also talked about when you would use it, what the differences between an app and a mobile website, and what hybrid applications are as well. So I went through all that sort of stuff, and then looked at frameworks too. So the frameworks that are designed to allow HTML to be formatted in such a way that it looks like a mobile device. And we'll be playing around with a few more frameworks tonight as well. And then lastly, we worked on the installation. So in my talk last week, we broke it off before we did the install, and then I separated out the installations into different videos. So you should have all of those up there. And I believe the Mac ones went up yesterday or the day before, I think. So check them out and go through them. There were quite a few requests for Mac. And in fact, tonight, all the builds that I'll be doing, I'm actually going to do on the Mac. So there's the Mac here that I'm giving the presentation on. And the reason for that is because I can do an Android build and an iOS build on the same platform. Whereas on PC, when I do it, I can only do Android. So I decided I would go with the Mac, but just because it will help out the greater number of people. But the commands are pretty much exactly the same. And I'll let you know where things are different and where, if you're using Windows, what you have to type. But it's pretty much exactly the same. Okay, so we covered off all that. So as I said, please make sure if you are wanting to continue with this course that you've caught yourself up, that you actually do have an install done, because we're going to be moving it along at quite a pace now. So if you find yourself left behind, you're going to have a fair bit really to go to catch up. All right, so a little bit of a post-mortem now. As I said, it was a bit painful. And it's one of these things where you find one thing and you start working your way down, then that doesn't work, and then you try and find a different way. And it can be quite an undertaking. And you might have even seen with the videos that I did that it wasn't straightforward. And one of the reasons why I did those as offline videos was because there is quite a bit of work in getting the thing to actually work. And if I did it as a live video, there's all sorts of back and forth and problems you've got to do to resolve issues. But I think we got there. So there were a couple of things that were left off within the video that I remembered afterwards, related to environment variables, particularly around the ant one, the ant environment variable. But I think that was covered off in the forums, and that was addressed. So if you were struggling, that is covered there. And there are a couple more things related to the builds on iOS that in the video I had some issues with building, which I'm going to go through tonight because those have been resolved as well. So if you're struggling with getting a build done under on the Macintosh OS X, I've worked that out for you too. So. All right, so it can be finicky, it can be painful, but once you get the install done, then everything is reasonably straightforward from that point on. Now, I'd say last week was the worst. This week is slightly better. The next 2 weeks after that are easy. So you just got to try and just follow me through, keep going, and I promise you it'll all be worth it. The easiest thing to do really is, well, the least amount of pain, depending on how much you enjoy pain, is to have one dev environment set up and then do cloud builds for all the rest. So you don't necessarily need to be running, for instance, Xcode and Eclipse on the same machine. You don't really need to be building for Android and iOS natively, or rather locally, if you don't want to. You can use the Adobe Cloud Build. That's what it's there for. So you can get one going, see how it works, and then deploy it out via the cloud if you want to, because that way you can get your debugging done as well. But yeah, nothing to stop you building total installations for every single platform if you want to do that as well, but just a little bit more work set up at the start. All right. So tonight, what are we going to cover off? Well, we've actually got quite a lot to talk through. It is quite complicated, but what I'm going to be doing is jumping in and out from the slides into the actual applications. So whereas last week it was mainly all slides, what I'll be doing tonight is actually doing some live builds for you, and we'll be working in Eclipse and Xcode and going through and actually issuing the commands so that you can see what's going on rather than just doing it all through slides. But what I have done is actually do screen captures of most of it as well, so that you don't have to go back through the video and try and find all the commands that we've used, so that they're there for you in this PowerPoint set as well. So they'll just make it a little bit easier, so you're not having to scroll backwards and forwards through a video and find where it was that I said something in particular. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at here is the build process. Then we're going to look at the basic single page application framework and why we want to use that and how that makes things fast and makes apps look good. We'll be spending quite a bit of time on jQuery mobile. And what I've done is I've actually mocked up a shell of an HTML5 application for you, which I'll be showing you. And it's not completed, it's very rough, but what it does, it will give you something to start from. And rather than telling you to go out and try and build one of these things from scratch, I found that it's probably easier if I give you something that's kind of a quarter of the way there, gives you something to build on, and you can see it working. And then you can add your own code to it from there. So this is something that I've got a native application already that I wrote in Objective-C for a client, and they've come back and said we'd really like to have it built for Android as well. And as far as I'm concerned, it's going to be easier to do it and rebuild it in phoneGap with the nature of the application. So I just started on it. It's something I started on yesterday. And so I'm going to use the shell of where I've got to so far with it to give to you to play around with, and we'll use it as our homework this week. So we'll be looking at that. Now we'll also be looking at the config file as well. Now the config file is quite important in terms of what the application is going to be called. It's got all the settings for the application in it. So we'll look at that and some of the variables that are in there and all the settings. Then we're going to start looking at the phoneGap API itself. So everything sort of builds up to this. And the funny thing is that actually using phoneGap is probably the easiest part of the whole thing. When we get to the point where we write the code where phoneGap talks to the hardware and takes a photo or uses the GPS or something like that, it's probably the simplest part of the whole thing. But it's everything leading up to that to actually get it all going so that we can do that takes the time. So we will be spending probably most of tonight getting up to that point. But the end result of it is that you will have an application that will take a photo and put it on screen within the application, and you can run it and play with it and everything as well. So I did realize someone mentioned to me that the homework last week that I set was to take a selfie, but unfortunately you couldn't really take a selfie when you had the application running. So I think a few creative people came up with different ways to do that, involving 2 or 3 cameras and everything. So I do apologize for that. But this week it'll be certainly, the homework's going to be a little bit easier to do in that regard. Okay, so we'll get the camera going. Then we're going to do some builds for both Android and iOS. We'll make it work, and we will either deploy it directly to a device, or we'll just upload it to Adobe Build that way as well. So I'll show you that all working. So hopefully it's all going to work in a live environment. So all quite interesting when you do these things live. That things that might have worked in the past don't work when you've got lots of people watching, but always fun. We'll give it a go. All right, so a few updates. Now, I mentioned that there were some changes that weren't reflected in the video. So if you are running Macintosh and you're trying to get your environment working, there are a couple of things here that need to be made note of. If you've struggled getting builds to work, one of the reasons, if you're running the latest OS X build that's just come out, the latest OS X operating system, Ant is no longer in the path. So you will find, if you're trying to run a build, that you might be getting errors if you've got the latest operating system. So this is something that's only just changed that I discovered this week. So we can get around that with these instructions that are down here. So what we've got to do is actually install this thing called Homebrew, which is similar to Node.js effectively. I'm not going to go into what it does effectively. All we're going to do is type in that Ruby command there, and then do the installation for Ant, and that will put it all in for you, and that will allow you to do a build for Android on the Mac. So if you've been struggling with that, this could be why. So I didn't mention it in the video because I wasn't aware that was an issue at that point. But it's something that's recently come up. So that will definitely fix it. Okay. Now, the other thing as well that you would have noticed if you were following through on the video for the installation on OS X was I was having some trouble getting builds to go. They were coming up with errors, and then I was just jumping straight into Xcode. And at that point, that was fine because we were doing a Hello World build, but it wasn't really a full solution at all. So we do want to be able to build directly from terminal on the Mac. And if you are having troubles where you get a lot of errors coming up when you do a build, often the cause of that is permissions. And you can get around that by using the superuser command, which is sudo, which superuser do, and then typing the command after that. And that will basically take control of the files and allow them to be overwritten. And now I haven't had a problem doing that every time. Pretty much every time I've had that error, I've just run it as superuser, and then that works. As far as all the PC people, when you see these commands, this is pretty much the same as what you're going to do on your PC under Windows. sudo, as far as Windows goes, is just running things as an administrator. That's the only difference. So yeah, don't worry too much about that. It just means that you're elevating the permissions so that you've got administrative access. That's all it is. So if you for the Mac, if you execute that first, that will allow that build to happen from the command line. Okay, so our build process, the things that we want to do, and it's important to get this build process working. I'm going to go over this quite a few times tonight, and we'll actually do it as well live, have a look at it and run it a few times, but you've got to make sure that you get it right. So the first thing we do is we create a phoneGap project, and that's with the phoneGap create command. Then we remove what we don't need, and we replace with the files that we do want. So if we were looking at it last week, we were just literally creating the phoneGap project and then building it, building the platforms, adding in the platforms, and then we were launching it because all we were interested in at that point was a Hello World, and that was the default. But what we want to do now is we don't want to build Hello World anymore. That's all right for week 1, but not much good for anything else going forward. So what we want to do now is write all our own code. So in order to do that, we actually have to take out the Hello World information and put in our own. So this means removing or the default code that gets created when you create a phoneGap project. So I'm going to show you what's involved in that. So over here, this is what gets created when you do a phoneGap create. You end up with this entire structure here. And if we expand here, www, down here, you'll see these folders. We've got CSS here, images, JavaScript, resources, and then this is just a default one that's created that's specifically for Hello World. So you can get rid of pretty much everything under here apart from the resources folder. And you can delete all the rest. I would, if I were you, unless you're wanting to make modifications to the icons and additional images that are associated with the app itself, I'd probably leave image and icon in there, and then we just put our ones into those folders rather than deleting them. But everything that's under these, they can all go. Now we are actually going to replace them, so we're going to create another CSS folder and a JavaScript folder as well, and put our images in there as well. So you can either just expand that and delete the stuff that's in it and replace it with your own, or you can just get rid of it completely and drag and drop on your structure. Now your structure should be the same as this. So the structure that we create with our HTML website, which is being turned into an app, should have our HTML in this level here, straight under www, followed by CSS, image, and you can call us anything you like, but it's got to be referenced. We'll just keep to a standard and call it JS as well. But res is referenced within the config file, so we need to leave that one there. Okay. Now we'll have a look at config in a minute as well. Okay, so what actually happens when you do a phoneGap build? So what a phoneGap build does is it takes all this information that's in here that you've created, so when we create our HTML, and it copies it in underneath the platform. So we have to have the platform set up already. So you've had to have done a phoneGap platform add, iOS or Android first, and then it copies all this information in there for the platforms that you are choosing to build. So every time, if you're working at this level here, every time you do a build, it's going to copy it in there. So what you don't want to do is go in here under platforms. In fact, let me just jump out here for a second. Rather than dealing with slides, let's actually just have a look at one. Okay, so here's our week 2 example. This is one that we're going to be working with today. So I've got this all completely set up here. Here's our index.html, JavaScript. Now I've replaced all this. We're going to look at this in a few minutes. I've replaced all the CSS here with the CSS that we need for this project and everything that's underneath it. And same with images. There's some example images that we've now put in there that we're using in this particular one. So this is all set up, ready to go. Now, when I do a build, it copies it from there into the platform that I'm interested in. In this case, I'm doing a build for both the Android and the iOS. I've installed those, and so it will copy it in here. And so we'll see a complete copy of everything sitting in here under that iOS one, and it'll be the same for Android as well. It'll just be set up slightly differently. Now, what you don't want to be doing is going and making changes in here directly to the code. What you should be doing is making all these changes here, and then they get copied when you do the build across to there. So that's important to note. The only time you would ever really be wanting to make a direct change to these is if you have something that's much, if you're doing 2 completely separate builds for Android and iOS where they're very different. But at that point, we're kind of losing this cross-platformness that we're talking about, and it's very easy to lose track of what's going on. All right, well, while we're out here in this this view here, why don't we just do a phoneGap create, just to go through the process that I've just said. Okay, so what I have here is my terminal window on one side, and I've got the Finder view over on this side, which is basically exactly the same. I'm sitting in the same folder. Let's just make sure. Okay. Oops. Oh, okay. I've deleted that folder, so I've got to go into my documents folder.
Hey Steve, it's James here.
Hi.
We've just got a few students asking if you could please zoom in.
Oh, okay. I wonder how I would actually do that. Can they not see it? I'm not sure if I can zoom in with this. Is it too hard to see? Is it on that resolution?
It'd be fairly hard to see, especially I think you're running a 1920 resolution or something. It's
I can.
scaling down pretty
Is
small.
it okay? I can try. I'll see if I can change the resolution of the monitor to see if that will make any difference. 1 second. Don't know if that's really done much here. We'll just hang on. Let's just see if we can do this without. Whoa, how's that? Does that look any different for you?
That looks good.
That looks better. Okay, all right. Okay, I'm just going to change this one here as well. Okay. All right.
Thanks for that.
All right, no problem at all. All right, back again. Hopefully you can see what's going on. Luckily we hadn't done too much at this point. Okay, so what we're going to do now, let's just do a test one just so that you can see the process. So we'll go phoneGap, phoneGap, create, and we'll just create one called test. Okay, and so now I'm just going to put these side by side so you can see them. So you can see now we've got one called test here, and it's got that entire structure under it. At this point, we've got no platforms added. Okay, so what we're going to need to do is change directory into that test one. That's where we are now. And we'll add the platforms that we want. Okay, so we've now added iOS there. Let's just have a look there. There's iOS, phoneGap, platform, and Android. Okay, and now we've got Android under there as well. Okay, so that's as much as we want to do at this point. We don't want to do a build just yet because we're going to copy everything out of here as we replace that, and then do the build so that it will copy it in. Okay, so but the main thing at this point is that we've got our platform set up. So this is what you should be doing to get your one going. We create the name of the project, and then we add the platforms. Then you copy in everything you want to do, and then we'll do a build for each one of those. All right, so we'll get rid of that now. Let's change back out of there because we won't need this one anymore. Okay. All right. Okay, so I've kind of gone through what the phoneGap build actually is. Now you still need to do a native build. So what a phoneGap build is it's creating a project for Android or for iOS, but it's not actually building that project. It's building a project, if that makes sense. It's not actually building the app. You need to then fire up Xcode or Android to do the build itself, unless you're going to be doing a cloud build, in which case then you just copy the www structure up to the internet and then just run that. So hopefully that makes sense. So you really have two builds that you've got to do, one to create the project and then one to actually do a compile. So they are two quite different processes, and it's important to understand the difference between those. So you'll get a bit confused because you're thinking, well, I've done a build, but all you've done is really build the project. Okay, so the other thing as well to note with this, and I should say that now too while we're here, is if I make changes, let's say that in here in my www directory, I make changes to my HTML. if you want to then see that reflected in iOS and Android, you've got to do a phoneGap build. So you're going to have to go phoneGap build iOS, phoneGap build Android in order to copy out those changes that you've made in under here into these platforms. Otherwise, it's not going to be reflected. Okay. So moving right along. And this is pretty much exactly the same thing. Let's just see if I missed anything out. Here's an example, phoneGap create. So this is what I typed. Again, this is really here for your reference so that you don't have to hunt through the video to find it. And then we change into the folder that we created. So you'll get an error if you don't change into it. If you try and add these platforms without actually being in the folder inside the project, then you'll get an error. So we change into the example there. Then we add the iOS platform, we add the Android platform from there, and then you can see here we do the build for iOS and we do the build for Android. Now you wouldn't normally, this stage, if we did the build, we're just going to build Hello World, but there is a step between these where we're going to copy over all our HTML, which at this point we haven't created. So that's what we're going to be doing tonight, is giving us ourselves a little structure so that we've got something that looks pretty. Okay, so in order to do that, we need to discuss frameworks. So we talked a little bit about what frameworks were last week, where I gave an example of probably 4 or 5 different ones that we could use. Some of them are expensive, some of them are free, and they ranged in quality and features, and just depending on what you wanted to do and what your budget was and what the project was, really. So they scale to different devices, pretty much all of them. That's the whole idea of it. And they add additional widgets and UI elements. Now, as I said, we're not doing a course on HTML5, but I am going to give you some of the basics so that you know what to do, so that we can actually get an app going. And as I said, I'll be giving you this skeleton structure that you can have a play with. So tonight what I'll do is we're probably going to spend 10 or 15 minutes showing you through jQuery Mobile, because this is going to be the foundation of what the app is. So you need to know really how to structure it and how to make it work and look good. All right, so I've chosen jQuery Mobile because it's standard. If you look on the internet for examples, there's thousands of them out there. It's a very, very common framework to use. It's very configurable as well. You can put lots of different themes onto it. You can change the look and feel of the buttons, all sorts of different things you can do with that. The other thing as well is that in Visual Studio, if you're doing it on a PC, you can create a mobile project and it will use jQuery Mobile underneath it as its foundation. So you can actually just go and basically create an ASP.NET MVC or straight.NET project, and it will use jQuery underneath it and give you a website that's all fully built with this right from the start, straight out of the box. So it's another good reason to try and integrate it with phoneGap, because it's nice and easy. There are downsides to it. It's a bit slow, and you're actually going to see that tonight. You're going to see when you start playing around with this thing that there are some downsides to it. It's not quite as smooth as a native app. There are hacks and things that you can do to it to get it running smoother, particularly when it comes to things like scrolling. And I'm going to give you a list of resources for that. But it's one of those things where you're starting to get into deep and dark kind of HTML hacking and JavaScript hacking to make the thing work really, really well, which is going a bit beyond the scope of what we're doing tonight. But the other thing as well, while we're talking about this, is that jQuery Mobile, as far as apps go, with what we're doing, native apps, it has to run locally. Now, a lot of the examples you'll see online where apps are using these, or mobile websites rather, are using these, they're calling jQuery Mobile from a CDN and offline other websites. Now, we can't do that. Otherwise, it's not going to get past Apple, or it's just going to be a bad experience in general. We want to make this thing run as fast as possible, and in order to do that, we have to download all of our code locally and have it sitting on the device. Now, if you remember from last week, we were talking how apps, to be a true app, it should really function quite well. Even if it's not connected to the internet, the UI should still be running really well and be responsive. Now, a website's not like that. If you lose your internet connection, you're not going to get a fast, responsive UI. You're going to get no UI at all. So, big difference there. So, this does mean there are more things to download. Now, to try and make this a little bit easier for you, I've already done it and built it into the skeleton project that I'm going to be uploading for you. But I'm going to show you where to download it and how to do it, because certainly it is something that you need to know how to do. So if you just do a search for jQuery Mobile, you'll come to this website, and you can download a copy of it there, and that will give you all the files that you need locally. And then it's just a matter of breaking it up and putting it in the correct folders. So I'll show you what you get. So if I expanded the download the zip file that you get from that website, this is what you get. So you'll see it's a combination here of CSS and JavaScript, and a few images as well. We don't need the demos. They don't need to go in with the project. It's just everything from here on down. Now, this is how we break it up. So you'll remember I was saying that we need to have a similar structure to what was already there in the Hello World example. So what you'll see here, we have our CSS folder, and we put all of this jQuery stuff under there. And likewise, we grab the images, we put them under there as well. And then the JavaScript gets separated out, and then that gets put there. And you'll see that we've left the res folder that's untouched. That's exactly as was created before when we did our phoneGap create. So other than that, it's the same, but all the stuff gets put in there, and we're going to make use of that in our HTML app. Okay, now you can extend it and you can change it. By default, jQuery is not the most amazingly attractive UI. It's not too bad, but you can certainly change it. There are lots of examples where you can do that. Now, I've actually expanded this one a little bit, extended it rather, and I've used the Square UI theme. I've downloaded that, and I've actually added that in. I'll show you that. But that link there will take you there if you want to look at some more themes as well, if you want to change it. All right. So in order to make use of jQuery Mobile, we need to reference it from within our HTML file. Now, I said that we were going to be working with a single HTML file. This is like a single page app. And we'll look at the structure of this and why you would want to do that in a minute. But within index.html, right at the top here, we need to reference these JavaScript files and style sheets. So you can see here, here's the CSS that we're referring to. This one here, Flat UI, this is just an extension that I've loaded to make it look a little bit more interesting. So this one here is the standard jQuery one. This is the extension. And then I've also got a style sheet that I created myself where I wanted to do some extra tricky things with some of the UI. And so I've got one called example, which I've also added. But the default jQuery one is this top one here that you would definitely need to have in there. Now, as far as the JavaScript goes, you need to have jQuery and jQuery Mobile. And it's important the order that these are actually executed in. So jQuery has to be first in here, and then jQuery Mobile. Okay, now that's really important. If it's not, you're going to get some issues. So we load that in. jQuery Mobile is based on jQuery, basically. That's the reason why. Then you'll notice these ones down here, Cordova and Cordova plugins. These are required in order for us to be able to make use of the API and the additional features of phoneGap. And these particular JavaScript files, you'll notice, are not sitting in the JavaScript directory. They're in the root directory, and they're created for us when we create the script, when we create the project rather. So they're sitting in there, and we can directly call them. So just to reiterate on that, you need the style sheet for jQuery Mobile. You need to have the JavaScript for jQuery as well as jQuery Mobile, and then you have to have the JavaScript, the two Cordova JavaScripts in there as well. Now, this particular bottom one that you can see, API calls, is one that I've created myself. We're going to go through this in a second, and I'm going to show you what each of these do. So don't worry too much about it. I'm basically going to break this apart, and then we'll look at the whole thing. So I mentioned that we've got a structure of a single page application. The reason for this is that when the page loads, it's going to load the entire project. It's going to load everything that it needs. Now, that will mean that the initial loading time as the app fires up might be a little bit longer, but it will mean that when we jump in between pages, it will be faster, which is what we want. So a native app takes a few seconds to load anyway, so this really doesn't take any longer. So we get maybe a couple of seconds at the start where it loads everything in, but from then on, our performance is very quick, because basically it appears that we're working with multiple screens, but in fact what we're doing is we're just jumping around within one page, and that makes the whole application run much faster. Now, the Problem with this is things can become messy because we're putting an entire application into one file, which is almost as bad as when the internet first came out, and probably even worse. So the potential for spaghetti code here can be quite nasty. So what you really do want to do is to have things like include files in there, references to other files if you can, so that when that file loads, it all loads at once, but it's easier to read, and so you can still reference it in separate files. And I'll give you some examples of that so we can see it. All right. Now, the concept of pages are defined with div tags. So if you look up here, the way that we break a page up into separate screens is by using this tag here, which is a piece of JQuery mobile. And so we say this div tag here, and there'll be a close div after it as well. Everything that appears between this and the close will be one page, and we give it a name. And so in this particular case, it's called search. And then you also have themes in jQuery mobile as well, and they're alphabetized. So there's a number of them. I just chose B for this particular one. So if we wanted to move to another screen, it's an ahref. So it's an HTML call, and it's with a hash at the beginning. And so if we wanted to jump to the search screen, we just put it in there, ahref equals search, and it will jump directly to that screen. So what I should probably do, I think, at this point is show you what the file itself is. So here it is here. So this is what I've mocked up. Now this is running in a browser right now. This is jQuery mobile. This is with its theme here. Now you can see I can kind of expand it, and it does a bit of that. And this is what we're going to be building and turning into an app. So the things to notice is we've got navigation up the top here. We've got a tab bar down the bottom, down here. And then all these controls look a bit different. Okay, now these are going to get converted to work as touch controls. So the way they appear in the browser right now is not exactly how they're going to appear when they're on a device. But these are drop downs here. Here we've got some buttons. Okay, so it doesn't look particularly attractive as a website, but it's going to work when we put it into mobile. This one here there's actually a date control, but it doesn't work unless it's running on mobile. So this is one of the reasons why you can't really debug by just using a browser. You really do need to deploy it to an emulator. So we've got a few of these in here. Now, if I click here on the search button here, it jumps here. Now, what a horrible font. I wonder how that happened. Anyway, what we've got here is a search screen. Now, these are all hard-coded at this point. And then I can click through there, and let's see, I should be able to scroll up and down within that. I can click on that. Okay, so this is it's a restaurant app. This is just an image in here. So we've got some issues. You can probably see we've got a tab bar scrolling off screen there. So there's a few things that need to be fixed up with this. But the thing to note here, see how we've got a back control on the top there. Okay, it looks like we lost our theme on that one as well. So yeah, still needs a bit of work here. But this allows us to go forward and back, and it looks much more mobile. So it will, even though it looks pretty ugly at the moment, once we put it on a device, it's actually going to look fairly good. Now down here, we can jump around. Now we haven't got screens designed for all these, but we can jump into this screen here, or we can jump back to that one there. Now this is all part of one page. This is all part of index.html. So clicking on these is just jumping it into a different section of that same page. Okay, so even when here where I'm clicking on search and I'm going in here and getting a list, that's still all the same page. Okay, so now you know what we're talking about, at least when we're showing you the slides. So let's go back to our slides now, and I'll go through the source of this in a minute as well. So we've looked at how we define pages. Now the tab bar down the bottom down here, this is a footer. This is how we define it. So data role equals footer there. It's important that you say that the data position is fixed. That locks it to the bottom so it doesn't scroll off the screen. And then we have a nav bar here. And then these are list items with ahrefs in them. And you can see here that they've got hashes where they'll jump to the various different pages. and we've got default images. You can use your own images, but jQuery Mobile ship with a few defaults, so I just use those for there. So it's just straight HTML, but it's being represented in a way that looks a little bit different. And it's really trying to replicate the look of an iOS device or an Android device. Okay, up here. Now you'll notice as well, this is another thing that's just happened in a recent build. This needs some space here, so that'll need adjusting as well. But you can see here that we've got a new page that's been created. So this page is called deal claim, and then we've got a header defined. And again, it's fixed. So it's stuck on the top. It's not going to move even though everything else is scrolling. And we've said that we want a back button. And so the back button appears over here, and then here's the title. Okay, so it's all pretty simple. Not hard to do. The hardest thing really about this is getting it working really smoothly and so that it works well. But actually getting something up and running is pretty quick. And here's a drop down, and so we have a label for it, which is just sitting up the top there, price, and then it's a select, just an HTML select. And you can see here when you click on that, and then this gives you the option of which one you want to pick. Okay, so there's lots and lots of stuff. If you go to the jQuery mobile site, it will give you lots of examples on demos that you can just literally copy and paste in, which is what I did here. So here's another one, which is a 3-part button, which again is a common mobile structure that you'll often see as a native control. And so this is set up as a collection of radio buttons. And so in order to do that within jQuery Mobile, we create what's called a field set and a control group there, and we say it's horizontal. We can theme it. We can pick which one we want checked. And then these are all radio buttons, and then we assign the values that are going to be associated with them all. So probably the easiest thing to do if you're just starting out with these is literally just copy and paste the examples and then replace the details with what you want on your one. So if you don't understand the syntax completely, use some examples and then it'll slowly make sense as you're dealing with it. All right, so let's have a look at it. We'll go in here now. I've got Dreamweaver set up on here just so we can see. So this was just something for the Mac. Now, oops, let's have a look at it. So we'll look at the code view only. So we looked at this at the start. This is index.html. So here's our head here, and we've got our style sheets, and we've got our JavaScript, and we've got our Cordova plugins being called here. And then we've got this API one that we haven't looked at just yet. And then you can see, if we scroll down a bit further, here's our page definition here, our first one. And then we've got this divided up into the form elements effectively that are here. There's price, booking date. This is a date type, so that's going to pop up a calendar control. Here's our buttons, cuisine, price, suburban city there. And we've got a search button there. Okay, now you see this one here, the ahref equals hash search list. So this is telling it to go to a new page when you click on it. Now, I guess it's important to say, I mean, it's reasonably obvious, but this is hard-coded data at this point. So this is not dynamic. If we were wanting to pull in live cuisine types, for instance, or we wanting to actually do a proper search where it comes back with a list of all the restaurants in a certain area, we'd be doing calls out to a database. And I am going to cover that stuff, so don't worry too much. But just for tonight, in order to get the structure set up, we've created a skeleton with all the stuff hard-coded just so you can get the thing working. All right, now down here we have the footer defined there, and so you can see here's all the elements that appear along the bottom there for us to click on to jump to a new page. And then here's search list. So we jump to search list from the search button, and so this is the next page. So it's still in the same file, and it's just defined here under the page command. Here's our header again, and then what we've got here is a unordered list, and it's a list view, and it's got a list of all the different restaurants that are near us. Now this one's got some issues in terms of the design and the coloring and everything, but in terms of functionality it actually works. And then there's another footer, And then I think if we click on one of these, where did they go to? It goes to deal detail. So if we clicked on that, then if we found down here somewhere, here it is, here's deal detail here. So this is the next screen. And so then this gives us the details on the deal for that particular restaurant. Again, all hard-coded and everything. And there's a button on that you can click on, deal claim. Okay, jump to that. So we're going down deeper and deeper, but you can get out of it because there's back buttons, which are part of the top bar, which lets you then go backwards all the way through out of it, and so on. So you just keep adding all your screens. Now, here is what we're going to talk about in a minute, which is where we start talking to phoneGap directly. But I'm going to cover that off in a minute. All right. So that's the structure of our HTML. Now, I'm not going to really deal with the HTML too much because this is something that your UI front-end developer and your graphic artists are going to work on a lot and get that all working really, really beautifully. And it's not really directly part of phoneGap. You can work for months on making this stuff look amazing, having beautiful HTML5 that does all sorts of different stuff. And to do that, that's really part of an HTML5 course. But this structure is going to allow us to then make the calls to phoneGap, which is what we really want to do. All right, so out of there. So there are many ways to make this thing faster, and it's important to note that when you run this on mobile, it's not going to be quite as smooth as what you'd get on a native app, but you can get there. Now, so certainly don't feel that when you play with it, you go, oh, this is not, this doesn't work quite as well as what it does on a native app. We can get there, but it needs 3D acceleration. You can pre-cache all your images. You can minify all your scripts. So that's things like JavaScript. They can be compressed, so it gets rid of all the white space and makes it much, much faster. So these are all the things that you then go through once you've got the thing built and you've really optimized your HTML to make it as just fly. And you certainly can get there, but that's a process of going through it and just looking at everything, the way it runs. It could be that, when you click on one button that there's a flash that just doesn't load quite fast enough. So then you go through your HTML and you find out what might possibly be slowing it down. So that's all part of optimization. Now, as I said, it is a bit out of the scope of what we're talking about tonight, but I've linked to you some resources there which are specifically for phoneGap and HTML. So there is quite a lot of stuff on the net out there, but that's a good place that you can start from. You can have a look at that, and that will give you some good resources for doing that if you really want to get into that side of things. All right, now so that's really reinforcing how we create a phoneGap app. We've already done that really, so we don't need to talk about that again. And so now that we've created all the HTML, we're going to go through this process. We've got our whole structure set up. We copy it all in. We put it into our new phoneGap structure that we've got there, just like that. Copy it all in, make sure it looks pretty. And then we're almost ready to add the platforms, but there's one more step that we need to do, and that's the config file. So we didn't really look at the config file last week. The only thing we mentioned was that if you're uploading to Adobe Build, you need to put the config file into the www folder before you upload it. But there are quite a few changes and things that you need to do to that config file in order to get it set up to work the way you want it. Otherwise, it's going to be called Hello World, and all your apps are going to be called Hello World. So there are some changes that we need to do there. So let's just have a quick look. Again, let's jump back into Dreamweaver here, and I've got a copy of the config here. This is config XML. So it looks a little bit daunting when you first see it, but it's actually reasonably simple, and there's not too much to it. So what I'll do now is we'll go through the various bits and pieces within that. So right at the top, we have the name of your application. So you just sit in there between the brackets, the name that you want to call it. You give it a description as well, and you can set the name of your author as well. And so this will make sure that this is what will appear on screen when it's got its little icon sitting on the app. So that's, if you're going to change anything, that's the thing you want to change, because otherwise it's called Hello World. All right, now this is one that you may struggle with. I certainly did when I started playing around with it, particularly if you're doing a build for iOS. The default iOS settings of the way this works means that if you have a tab bar down the bottom and you have a nice header across the top, it bounces up and down because effectively it's a web page. And so I don't know if you can remember from playing with an iOS device with a phone, that when you're surfing the web with it, that it actually bounces when it gets to the bottom and when it gets to the top, and you can pull it past where the display, where the content is, and it's like it's on a rubber band. Well, phoneGap creates all of this HTML within a web view, and so when we put it into an Xcode project for iOS, we actually get that same way of working. So we actually get that rubber band effect, and it destroys the whole look and the way that it's supposed to work, because you suddenly realize that you're not actually got a real tab bar there. This is actually just a web view because it's bouncing up and down when you scroll down. So what this will do here, if you change this preference, we disallow overscroll, and that means that it can't go past, and we also stop it from bouncing. So we say false to that. Now, the reason we've got disallow scroll in here twice is one of these is for Android and one of them's for iOS. So this one is actually for Android. So just copy it, both of them, and that will make sure. So Android's has got it's case sensitive in this particular instance. So put that in there. And this one's a bit of a tricky one to find, and lots of people tear their hair out about this particular instance. Now, there is a caveat to this, in that when you turn off these, then scrolling is much, much slower and it's a bit sticky. So the downside is that the responsiveness of the application drops probably by about 50%. So if you don't have a tab bar and you don't have a top header, then don't set these, and you'll get a much, much smoother and better reacting application for it. Now, there are ways around this again, but that's going back to those resources that I showed you before, and some of those will show you how to have no web view bounce and no overscroll, plus having a nice smooth sort of scrolling experience as well. So we're getting right down into kind of the details of the look and feel and the way that the actual app itself moves and works. But it is important to know, because these sort of things do get quite frustrating. And certainly if you submit this to the store, to Apple, and you've got a tab bar that's bouncing up and down the bottom, it will definitely be rejected. They won't like it at all, because it doesn't conform to the way that things are supposed to work. All right, so a few other sections that are sitting there in that config. We've got the icons. So if you want to change your icon of what's displayed on screen, here are the Android ones and here are the iOS ones. Now, you'll notice that there are different resolutions, and these depend on whether you're running Retina or not. And I think those ones are for iPad as well, the bigger ones. So if you're going to create an icon, you've got to create them at these different resolutions. So they're 57 by 57, 72, and these 57 two times and 72 two times are the Retina ones, which means that they actually have to be double that. Okay, so you've just got to put these under the resources. So icons are probably the last thing you need to worry about at this point, to be honest, but certainly something that once you're happy with your app, you can create yourself a nice little pretty icon, but just realize you're going to have to do a few different versions of it. And then the same goes for Android as well. You can also create your own splash screen here, and you can see again, these are just for different resolutions. That's all that is. And these are the resolutions that you've got to create for iOS. And I mean, if you think this is a bit of a pain to do, this is exactly what you've got to do when you do a native app as well, if you're submitting to the store. And it is annoying, but it's so that it works across the range of different resolutions that have been designed. So if you're creating splash screens and icons, create them at a nice high res in Photoshop or whatever you use, and then scale them down later, because you're going to need them at lots of different reses. So certainly don't start at the small one, then scale up, because they're going to look a bit bad. Okay, so once we've done all that, we can build that Android, and if we've got a problem with building iOS, we can also do that. And happy days, it will all be done, and we'll have our project. So perhaps we should go and do that now. Let's jump back over here, and here we've got our screen. So what are we looking at? Let's find out where we are. So we're in the development directory. Let's have a look. So we've got our week 2 example. We'll change into that one, and I'll clear that screen. Let's have a look. All right, and also we'll give you the Finder view as well. All right, so at this point I've copied everything in that I need. I've adjusted my config XML, I've rewritten it. Everything sitting under the www directory down there has got all the new stuff that I've created. So I'm actually ready to do a build. So I can go and build one, phoneGap, build iOS. Hey, now this is what I was talking about before. So if you got this error, all you've got to do is, let me clear this so you can see it, run it as super user. And what it is really is it's just when you've been playing around with the files, sometimes some of these other processes take control. There we go, that's built. And let's do the same thing. We'll see if we need to do it for Android or not. Yep, same thing, we'll have to do it for that one too. Let's give that a minute, there we go. So that's now built. Now, if we have a look over here now, if we go into our platforms, we should see now, I already showed you this so you knew they were here anyway, but if I go into iOS, I now have an Xcode project. So I'm going to open that here, and this is Xcode itself, and this is now the Xcode project that's been built, and I can run that in the emulator from here. So I can choose which of these devices I want to run it on. So we'll start by running on iPhone 6, and let's have a look at it and see what it looks like. Okay. Now I haven't talked to you about some of the stuff that I've got in here, but let's just have a look at it. So you can see, there we go, that's running. That looks good. Let's see if this clicks through. It does. Still got some ugliness going on there, but all seems to run. Okay, we can go back. Okay, all working. Let's have a look in there. That's working too. Now we haven't hooked this stuff up yet. We're going to talk about this in a minute. This is the phoneGap specific code, but that all runs fine for us. Let's do the same thing for Android. Okay, so I've got Eclipse here as well. Now I've already loaded this example in already, but I'll show you how to do it. Let me just, we'll clear this out. We'll delete that out off there. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to new project, and we're going to import an Android project from existing code. So it's easy to get this wrong because sometimes what you can do is you go in here and you go, oh, new Android application project, but that's not what we're wanting to do because we've already got an Android project that's been built for us by phoneGap. So we go File, New Project, and then we're going to import it from the existing one. So now we need to find out where it is. So let's see where it's being created. Come on. And we're in here, week 2 example. That should be the right folder. See if we can find it, and it can. There it is. It's found an Android project sitting there under platforms. I had a look through the folder structure. So we'll let that, it's brought it in. Okay. And now we'll do a build on this. Let's just clear out some of this stuff that's already here, and we'll run that. And so this is going to go and compile it. Now it does tend to take a little bit longer under Android than it does for iOS. Their emulators take a little bit longer as well, just to fire up. Okay, but there we go. It's running. So let's have a look. All seems to be there. Actually, let's have a look at the calendar control too. We didn't look at that before. There we go. So that's a nice native looking calendar we've got there. And you can see it looks a little bit different under Android, but it's more the Android kind of look, which is what we're after. And so click through here, make sure this all works all right. Seems to be fine. Okay, and you'll see that issues are different between Android and iOS too. So the top bar looks fine here because we haven't got the other stuff that's over the top normally with the other one. So That's all good. It's all working quite well. And that would be ready. We'd be able to deploy that to a device. And then we'll look in here, and this is the next part that we're going to do. So we've successfully now taken that project that we created under Dreamweaver, and we've deployed it out through Eclipse and through Xcode. So let's just get out of that. We'll go back to where we were before. I kind of jumped ahead of myself a little bit there. I wasn't intending to show you the entire thing at this point, but we do now really want to get into the phoneGap portion of it. All right, so I've just showed you that entire process there. The next part is adding APIs. So what we've done up until now is basically just an HTML website. It's nice, and it runs well, and it's a nice little app, but it doesn't really take advantage of any of the hardware, which is the whole point of this, really. So the entire reason that you get phoneGap is so that you can access the hardware. So tonight, what we're going to do is start by looking at the API. Next week, we're going to get into this in a lot more detail. But what we're going to do tonight is make use of the camera, just as an example. So in order to do this, under the newer versions of phoneGap, you actually have to explicitly add the APIs that you want to work with. So what we want to do tonight is work just with the camera. So we can use this command here, phoneGap plugin add, and then the name of the plugin. So in order to find out what the name is, you're going to have to actually get it from the phoneGap site, but it's got a full list of everything. So if you wanted to work with a GPS, you just look up phoneGap GPS on the phoneGap site, and it'll tell you what the name of it is. In most cases, it's going to be something like org.apache.cordova.gps or something. It's nothing too complicated, but we add that in, and then that will install it for whatever platforms that you've currently got installed, which is Android and iOS. Okay. And so, but that's not the only place you need to do it. You also need to actually add it into the config file too. So this is the command here that you've got to do. Now, I can't tell you what all of these are because they do differ via for whichever API it is that you're using, but all of this is documented on the phoneGap site. And this is where you would then go when you want to, you've got a specific need in mind, you just go and look it up. But we're going to do this one by one as we work our way through the various APIs. So the whole goal of this course is really to show you everything that phoneGap can do. So at this point, we're actually really, for the first time after we've gone through everything else, we're actually playing around with phoneGap and seeing what phoneGap can do. Everything else really is just being configuration. So it's near the end of week 2, and we're finally getting to it. But this is really where most of the power is. So just to reinforce that, to go over it, you need to, from the command line, you need to install that to make sure that plugin is actually installed and available to both projects or however many you're building for. And then you also need to put in some commands into the config file too. Now, if we have a look, now I've taken a screenshot of it, but because we've got our little view of it here, we can actually go and have a look ourselves. So let's just, here's our structure. And under plugins, we can see that this has been pre-installed already. I issued that command, and there is everything we need in order to make use of the native camera right there. And so if this has been correctly done, then that will work for you. Now, that it is important to know, again, one of these little gotchas, if you're having trouble and you're finding the camera's not working, even though you've done everything right and you're 100% sure that your code is completely the same as what I've given you or an example that you found on the net, then what I suggest you do, and this worked for me because I was having this problem actually getting the camera to work, and what I did was I deleted the platform and I deleted the plugins folder and I recreated them both and added them again, and then it worked. And that's actually a known bug, and it particularly affects iOS. So if you do have some struggles and you find that some of these APIs are not working for you, then you may actually have to regenerate the platform. So that means you're going to have to do another a platform add, basically, to add that in there. And yet another reason, really, to keep everything out here in the www directory where you're building stuff, because if you ever need to delete what's going on in there. So that effectively deletes the Xcode project and the Android project, and then you reinstall the plugins. All right. So that there is what we've just looked at. What's there for the camera. Okay, so now we're going to start programming this. So we're actually going to start controlling the underlying hardware through the phoneGap API. So the best way to do this is to actually have a separate JavaScript file for all your phoneGap interactions, and to try and structure your project in such a way as it's going to be easy to read. Now, already it's a little bit difficult because we've got one index.html, which is quite a pain to read, to go through. If you've got lots and lots of pages, it's certainly complex. So if you can keep the JavaScript out of it and just link it in from the top, then it's going to be much better. So there's one event anyway that you've got to handle right from the start, and that's to make sure that phoneGap is actually ready to start processing. Now, the reason for that is that sometimes the web views can load first before phoneGap itself is ready, and if you directly start referencing hardware, it might not have basically spun up and be ready to go. So this is an example from the phoneGap documentation. In this case, they've actually put the whole thing in one file. The reason for that is just because it's so small and it's easy to read. So you can see here that they've called the Cordova JavaScript file right from the start. Now this is not, they haven't styled this anyway to make it look like anything special, but we're just directly talking to phoneGap at this point. So they've got a function on load. Now that's called when the body loads. So this is where it's actually calling it down here. So when this page loads for the first time, it's going to call this function. And this is going to add an event listener. Now what this means is that we have a callback when something happens. So if you're familiar with event-driven programming, or you've heard of that, what we do is we set up little functions that will trigger when certain events take place. So in this particular case, we're saying add an event listener which will listen and do something when a particular scenario occurs, and in this case it's device ready. So when the phone becomes ready, then we will trigger off this thing here on device ready, and you can do something. Now they're not doing anything at all at this point. So normally what you would do at this point would be perhaps to set a global variable saying the phone's ready to start accepting phoneGap commands, and then every phoneGap command you just check to see if that variable is set or not. So I can show you, actually before we go to that, let's have a look at our code for that. So now let's go back to index.html for a second. And you recall from earlier I said here that we've got API calls.javascript here. So this is the file. So we've added a document.event listener. This should actually be in the onload. Okay, so to be technically correct, so it doesn't trigger too many times. Don't be repeatedly adding event listeners, so that's something that could be fixed up with that one. And we call on device ready. And in this case, I'm just popping up an alert. I'm going device is ready. But I would, if I was going to extend this and make this work properly, I'd set up a variable at this point as well. So that might be something you want to have a look at this week for your homework. And you will notice when I ran that in the simulator, it actually said device is ready because it had added the event listener, and then phoneGap let us know that it was ready to go. Okay, so we're going to jump back to that again in a second. So the next thing we do is in our index.html itself, we want to actually start taking some photos. So let's just have a look at the simulator here for a second. Device is ready, so that fired up. That's nice. Now what we're looking at is here. So we want something to happen when we press this button or when we press this button here. Now let's see whether that's set up. If I have a split view so I can work my way through it, go here to account, let's have a look, and here it is down here. Okay, so we're in our little view here. This is our account page, and what we're doing in this point is letting the user set their own photo, so they can take a photo of themselves and set it on the screen. So I've created a button at this point here, and the button says take photo using camera or take photo from library, and the on click event is set to call this function here, take photo using camera or take photo from library. These two functions are in my API calls.javascript file. So here they are here, function, take photo using camera, and take photo from library. And they are both actually calling a photo called take photo. Now I copied and pasted this. I didn't even write it myself. I stole it straight off the internet in order to have something to show you tonight. So this take photo function has a parameter called source type. And so if we want to take a photo using the camera, we'll use camera.pictureSourceType.camera. And if we're going to use the library, it'll be camera.pictureSourceType.photoLibrary. And so it calls this down here and sets up some camera options, including the quality, where we're going to get it from, the destination type, where it's going to go to, and the source type, which is the camera, and whether the orientation needs to be corrected. Okay, so these are just some basic camera options. And then, and these are all phoneGap commands here, navigator.camera.getPicture. So this is actually going to call the underlying native commands to allow us to take a photo. So this has 3 parameters, one for what happens if it works, one for what happens if it fails, and then the various options that are associated with that. So if it succeeds, it's going to call a function called onSuccess, and if it's going to call one that, if it doesn't work, it's going to call it onFail, and then these are just the options to do with it. So on success, if this happens, we are taking in the image data itself, and then we are looking in the document for an element called myImage to see if we've actually got an image there called myImage, and if so, then we're going to give it the data that's been taken from the photo. Okay, so again, don't worry too much exactly what all this means, because this is basically boilerplate code that you can cut and paste and use depending on what you want to do. It's not often you have to really think about this too much, unless you're wanting to do some kind of image processing or something on it. But it's fairly rudimentary stuff that you'll be doing on a regular basis. So you can just make use of this, copy and paste it really. Now, if it doesn't work, we're going to pop up an alert and say it failed. Now, let's just try that, because we've got this running somewhere here. Where is it? Here. Okay, let's see what happens if I click on that. Now I get the failed, and that's because there's no camera available on the emulator. It just isn't going to work. Now, if you ran that on your hardware, though, that would work because you have a camera. Now this one's going to try. I'm trying the library, see if it's got any photos. This photo is actually part of this emulator, which is handy. There we go. And there's our new selfie picture of a waterfall, which has been set. So we know that is all going to work. There's only a certain amount that you can do within an emulator before you have to put it to a device. So some things like GPS, for instance, if you haven't got a GPS on your emulator because it just physically isn't built into the computer, or a camera, then you actually have to push it out to the device to check it. But there we go, another one. Set that, and there it is set. Okay, so that's all working pretty well. Quite happy with that. And that's pretty much all there is to it. So as I said, the phoneGap component is probably the easiest part. So I've got that there for you if you want to go back and refer to it, exactly how that works, so that you make use of it. And as you can see there, we can have that running. We've already run this running under Android and running under iOS. And if you run this on a device, I pushed it out directly to my device, there you'll get something like that working straight on your screen. Okay, so I'll actually do a build for you tonight as well, and we'll push this out to Adobe build as well, just to check that, so you're familiar with how that works as well. Now, one more thing to cover off before we finish up with this is how you would make changes. So it's important to know how to do this, because it's all very well to get your HTML 100% right and then do the builds, but without a doubt you're going to need to go back and change it at some point. So the process for this is go into your, wherever you've got this stored. So if whatever editor you're using for doing your HTML, it might be Visual Studio if you're on a PC, or it could be anything really. So make all your changes that you want, and you make sure that this is sitting in the correct folder, which is the top level www one. It's not the one that's under platforms. So you make your changes, and then you build it. And so you call build on iOS, and you call build on Android. And then you go into Eclipse or Xcode or both, depending on what you want to do, and then you build in there as well, because you actually have to build the project that's being created. Now, under Eclipse, if you make a change, you may need to actually do a refresh. So if you're working in Eclipse, what you need to do is come up here into your list of packages here and click on this and go refresh down there. And that'll make sure that it brings in the most current version, because otherwise sometimes it doesn't detect that the project's actually been updated. Xcode's pretty good about it. Xcode, you can make any number of changes and the software actually detects that it's been modified and it will reload it in the background. But Eclipse doesn't do that. All right, so that's quite a lot we've managed to cover off there. We've got a working Android version, we've got a working iOS version. The last thing that we need to do at this point is try and get this built and running up to phoneGap build. So I've loaded this up here. Here you can see Hello World, which is from last week. And hopefully I'm still logged in over here. We'll give this another go. Okay, so build.phonegap.com. We want to upload a zip file. Now, let's just go over this one more time, because again, this was something that was in the slides last week, but may not necessarily be the clearest unless you see it running for real. So let's just have a look here. So I've created the zip file here, but let's get rid of that for a moment. So when we upload to Adobe Build, it doesn't really matter at this point what we've got in the way of platforms. We don't care about that, because the build process is going to handle all that. All we really care about is everything that we've written here in the HTML and our CSS files and the JavaScript and everything like that. But what it does rely on, let me take that out. What it does rely on is having the config.xml file set up. So what we need to do before we copy it up there is take our config.xml and put it into the www folder. So let's just have a look at that and make sure it's the right one. Yes, it is. You can see here, week 2 example, jQuery mobile and camera. Okay, so it's definitely the right one. So we'll copy that and we'll put it in here. So we've definitely got it there. And then we just zip that up. So let's compress that. And there's our zip file. So what we'll do now, let's upload that. And where are we? Development and week 2 example. And there it is, www.zip. We'll let that upload for a second. This might take a minute. It does take a little while to do the build once it's once we've got it there, but it's just worth going through the entire process so that you're familiar with it. Again, don't worry too much about this warning here. That's fine. Okay, so here we go, week 2 example. So now you can see that it's pulled this in off our config. All right, so we are ready to build. So press ready to build there. And it's going to go and build us an iOS version and an Android version and a Windows Mobile, which is quite handy because that's something that we haven't got at this point. Now, this one would be interesting to test. I haven't tested this myself as somebody else, only as with my own phone, but you may be able to actually scan this QR code yourself on here and install this straight onto your phone from what we've been working on tonight. But you've just got to wait until this is built. These will go blue when they're ready to go. And then if you have a QR reader, you can just fire that up on your phone and then just scan that QR code right there, and that'll put it onto your phone. So then you can go, they're all built. I've got my QR reader. This is not going to help much because you're not going to be able to see it really. But there we go. It's now telling me, it'll come back with a screen in a minute. It says buildphonegap.com would like to install week 2 example. I say install. And that's now going off for me right now and building that. And I can see that appearing on the screen for me right now. Okay, well that is pretty much everything I wanted to talk about tonight. We've covered off quite a lot, but this should get you all the way through to where you need to be starting to build apps. So we've covered off a lot of our HTML. We've covered a lot of JQuery mobile. We've built for iOS. We've built for Android. We've deployed to the build service with Adobe. Done quite a lot of stuff. Now, what I will do is provide you with a zipped up copy of what I've worked on tonight, but I'll take out some of it, mainly the camera code, so that you can put that in yourself and make sure that it works for you. So I don't really want you working, getting everything that we've worked on working straight off the bat. Otherwise, you won't really learn anything. But you're quite welcome to make modifications to that. So perhaps you would like to have a play around with that file, make it look pretty. You could change the graphics, make it change the themes, fill out a couple of those buttons that don't have screens attached to them. Mess around with the camera some more. There's lots of options there. You could even go and have a look at the API documentation. But what I'd like to see everyone achieving for next week is having the working camera and something working on your own device, whether it's Android or iOS, because that'll show that you've got all the build process and working, that you've got jQuery mobile installed, and that will mean then for next week that we can really cover off all the rest of the APIs. So next week, we're not going to have to worry about so much of all this configuration stuff that we've done tonight, but we can just look at all the phoneGap API stuff. And then in the last week, we're going to look at making things dynamic. So we'll look at things like how to store things locally and how to call data from Ajax and that sort of stuff. So it's rather than just working with static HTML like what we've got tonight. All right. That's all I want to talk about. Are you there, James? Are there any questions or anything that we want to go over at all?
Yep, we've had a few questions come in through the night
Okay.
that I'll put to you if that's all right.
Yeah, sure.
Just the first question here from Jay is, can we define our own data role?
Well, you can. Jay, yeah. What I would do first of all, though, is stick with what's there that jQuery's got just to get it going. But you can, if you look at the jQuery documentation, you'll be able to see all the various various changes you can make to it and things. But yeah, there are a lot of options there that you can do, and I'm pretty sure the data role is one of them as well.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
Indra has asked, can we use require.js with phoneGap easily?
Well, you can use anything you like. I've just picked this particular one because it's easy to use. But yeah, there's there's Angular JS that you can use, and there's Knockout, and there's lots of different stuff. But I guess the point of what we're doing at the moment is to really just show you how we can integrate phoneGap directly into the app. So I really don't mind too much what you use JavaScript wise, just as long as you get an app that's up and running and looks like something that we could submit to the store. So yeah, feel free to really use whatever you like underneath it, but just be aware that I'll only really be supporting what I've shown in the lecture, because I can't really get my head around every single framework that we've got out there, unfortunately. So
I think that's a good one for the discussion forum for the week 2 homework thread that I'll put up shortly.
Sure.
I think it'd be great to see people using different frameworks and showing what it looks like. And,
yeah, actually, that would be great.
Sharing experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing I should mention as well is there's a lot of people out here who've been listening who might be, HTML5 experts, and they're wanting to transition this into generating apps. And so, a lot of what I've covered might look extremely simple or basic. And so you're quite welcome to take your expertise that you've got there and then tie it into some phoneGap stuff. So, I'd really love to see what you can come up with UI-wise with some, advanced features of some of those frameworks. It'd be great to see, actually. So.
Yeah, I think we'll see some good ones. Just another question here. How secure are the phoneGap plugins and the phoneGap framework itself? I guess secure possibly in terms of reverse engineering, I'm not sure.
Well, what happens is that these APIs are calling down into the native ones themselves, so they're about as secure as the native API calls are. So, iOS is inherently more secure than Android is, only just because it locks everything down a lot more. But yeah, I mean, I think you're fairly right. I mean, it's more what you do with it more than anything else. I mean, I don't know if anyone's seen in the news lately. There's something going around about how all the flashlight apps on Android are malware and taking network stuff and sending it back over the net. I mean, that's more the kind of thing we're talking about. But in terms of security, yeah, we're really just calling native calls. So I mean, it's nothing that's any less insecure than what you'd do if you're writing the app natively. So.
There's a question from Tony here, just asking for Adobe Build, and I think we saw it up on your screen too. It's advised that version 3.50 was out of date. How
Yeah,
easy is it to upgrade to 3.63?
that's actually something I've got to look at this week. Yeah, I actually can't give you an answer on that because I haven't looked into it myself. So if I could hold that question over till next week, I'll rather than try and make something up, I'll try and answer it over the next few days for you if you like.
That'd be good. Thanks. Um, and we'll just go one more question. Donald's asking, how secure is Adobe Build?
Well, I guess it depends what you're meaning by how. Yeah, I'm going to try and understand what you mean by how secure is it. I mean, it's.
Actually, he said if I'm working on a DoD project, would I use it?
Oh, well, that depends on the particular. It
I
depends on
guess
your
there are
license
lots
that
of
you've got.
requirements in DoD,
Yeah,
what
you've
they
got.
say about cloud.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it depends for one on what your subscription is that you've got with Adobe, because I'm pretty sure that the free version puts a lot of this stuff in the public domain available to be downloaded, and you only get a certain number of private ones. I'd have to go back and check. But I mean, if you're working with the Defense Department, I wouldn't be putting anything on the cloud, really, to be honest. Yeah, and I have a feeling that there'll probably be some fairly tight regulations about that, because effectively your code is sitting up there out of your control. So it would just be like using Dropbox or anything else. It's there's probably some parameters that you're working under that would disallow that. I would say. I mean, it might be fine for just doing some test prototyping, but I think if you're working on anything sensitive, you should really probably have your own installs and keep it away from anything cloud-based.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, actually, just one more, um, an easy one. Can the build iOS be used on a PC?
Uh, well, you can't build for iOS on a PC. Um, you can, well, even taking the APK that comes out of it. I mean, yeah, you need, if you're going to be doing an iOS native build, you actually have to do it on a Mac. So, or use the Adobe one. So there's really no way round. There's no way you can do a native debugging sort of version using a PC. You're going to have to do it via Adobe Build and then upload from there. So you can still do all your iOS builds, but you really can't debug on the PC. If you're wanting to run an emulator, there's really no way around it without having a Mac, unfortunately. So,
Cool, thanks.
all right, excellent. All right, well, I think that covers it off. Thanks again for that, James, and thanks everybody for sticking with us. I do appreciate that so many people are sitting up at night listening to configurations of this stuff. It's fairly heavy going, but I think it's the outcomes are really worth sticking with because you can get some good stuff out of it. So next week it'll be probably a lot more fun because we've got all the heavy stuff out of the way and we just start playing around with all these little hardware devices from here.